for 5 minutes.
Madam Chair, I want to associate myself with concerns of my colleagues and say that I too am very disappointed with the process by which the Build Back Better Act has moved through the House. I like the bills we're debating today, but apparently sometime in the process this week, the drug provision pricing provisions, commonly known as H.R. 3, which we did not pass out of this committee in our previous markup of Build Back Better, have gotten back into the bill. Now, as you all know, nearly 2 years ago when this was first proposed in this committee, in the subcommittee, I raised issues of constitutionality because on its face, it is clearly unconstitutional. I stand by my arguments that by imposing an excise tax of up to 95% on certain sales, 95% of the gross on certain sales and certain pharmaceuticals, this legislative text violates the Fifth Amendment. If legislation causes property to suffer a significant diminution of value or deprivation of economically beneficial use, legislation results in a regulatory taking. I don't see how you can do 95% excise tax and say that that doesn't qualify as a regulatory taking. Now, I may want to remind you, because you might think it's just me making a partisan ploy, that the Nonpartisan Congressional Research Service agrees with my assessment. And in fact, they went one step further and said it may also violate the excessive fines section of the United States Constitution, because a punitive forfeiture violates the excessive fines clause of the Eighth Amendment if it grossly disproportional to the gravity of takes disproportionately to the gravity of a defendant's offense. Now, what's interesting about this, Madam Chair, is that I've been making this argument now for just about 2 years. This first came up about 2 years ago. No one has come up to me and said, wait a minute, Morgan, take a look at this Supreme Court case. Morgan, take a look at this legal theory to say you're wrong because it fits into this niche. Not one person has come forward. All I get are blank stares. I submit that my colleagues on the other side of the aisle and even on the floor know or ought to know this piece of legislation, this part of the bill, is unconstitutional. Further, the legislation fails to include an appropriate method of overseeing the so-called negotiation process. It states that the process of renegotiating eligible drugs would not be subject to administrative or judicial review. It also allows for the negotiation process to be implemented in years 25 and 26 without going through the rulemaking processes. This phrase, the Secretary shall implement by program, instruction, or otherwise, appears repeatedly in the drug pricing section, leading me to believe that HHS would not be required to open their process to public comment. All of this leads me to conclude that the HHS would be imposing restrictions with no public input, and there would be no judicial or administrative review of their decisions. How is that due process? I ask, how is that due process? The Fifth Amendment simply states, no person shall be held to answer for a capital or otherwise infamous crime unless held on a presentment or indictment of a grand jury, except in cases arising in the land or naval forces or in the militia when in actual service in time of war or public danger. I don't want anybody to think I'm leaving anything out. Nor shall any person be subject for the same offense to be twice put in jeopardy of life or limb. Nor shall be compelled in any criminal case to be a witness against himself. Nor be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor shall private property be taken for public use without just compensation. Here we're taking private property, we're taking property, and we're doing it with no judicial or administrative review of the HHS decision. We're clearly in violation of the Due Process Clause if we pass this, and so a true negotiation about drug pricing could have been worked out. We want drug pricing language too. That's why we have H.R. 19. But instead of negotiating and working together and trying to find a solution that works for American people, the Democrats, and not the Democrats on this subcommittee, and not the Democrats necessarily in this committee, but the Democrat leadership continually has decided they're going to continually beat their head against the wall and fight for H.R. 3, notwithstanding the fact that leadership knows or ought to know That drug pricing scheme is unconstitutional. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. Are there other members that wish to speak on